Hello, welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be showing you some embroidery stitches and teaching you how to make little flowers. This idea came from a viewer actually who asked in the video where I embroidered that cardigan if I could teach you guys some embroidery flowers. So here we are. Although this is a little bit different to what I usually do, I usually make full garments and stuff. This week we had Earth Day, and I think it's really important to celebrate that and to kind of think about how we can be more sustainable in our practices as, you know, seamstresses, sewists, general fiber crafters. I think that embroidery is something that we can use creatively to help extend the lives of our garments, just like I did in that video. Not only can you use embroidery to decorate, maybe it's something that has a hole in it or a stain and you don't know how to fix that or how to mend that, and this could be a really creative way to do that. Today I'm only going to be showing you flowers because for two reasons really. One, it's spring, and two, I like embroidering flowers, so that's what I usually go to the most. But I'm actually going to show you each stitch you need to create those flowers, and I'm going to give you examples of other things you can do with those stitches. I chose some flowers that use a nice range of stitches so that you can then go forth and make not only flowers, but lots of other things. Just a quick disclaimer before we get started. I am assuming that you have some rudimentary sewing knowledge. I'm assuming that you already know how to hold a needle, how to thread it. That is it for the intro, long as always. Let's go and do some embroidering. To get started with embroidery, you obviously need something to embroider on. I am using this bit of scrap canvas from last week's video to make a sampler for this week's video. Woven fabrics are easier to embroider on, especially natural fibers and looser weaves. It's obviously possible to embroider on any fabric, but the thread, needle, and design will need to be adjusted accordingly. If you're just starting out, it's best to practice on things like denim, chambray, muslin, broadcloth, linen, or shirting cottons. You'll also need an embroidery hoop to keep your fabric taut while you work. It also helps you hold the work better. Hoops come in varying sizes, shapes, and materials. My favorite is this one. It's a wooden hoop. Oh my god, that's so hard to say. It's a wooden hoop with a 16 centimeter or 6.3 inch diameter. Needles are a must for this craft, and these are my all-time favorite. They're size 26 embroidery needles. You can get embroidery needles online and in craft shops and haberdasheries. There's lots of sizes. The most important feature of an embroidery needle is that the eye of the needle is big enough for the embroidery thread. For thicker fabrics, you want blunter needles, and for thinner fabrics, you want sharper needles. And of course, you'll need some thread. In this video, I am going to work with embroidery floss, which is a cotton thread that's made up of 6 strands applied together that are really easy to pull apart. I usually work with 2 to 3 strands. This makes for more delicate lines and also means that your floss lasts 2 to 3 times longer. You can get cheap thread online and in craft shops, but I recommend you use Anchor or DMC. They make higher quality threads that, while more expensive, make for a much more pleasant and less frustrating embroidery experience. I have a big collection, obviously, as I've been doing embroidery for around 7 years now, but I buy a lot of them secondhand at secondhand craft shops and flea markets. The very last material you need is a marker of some sort to transfer the designs onto your fabric. Once you're more proficient, you may be able to freehand, but I would recommend starting with marking. I like heat erasable pens because they're easy to use and the markings disappear once you press the fabric. The 6 flowers I'm going to show you today are roses, lavender, daisies, chamomile, sunflowers, and hyacinths, which I still am not sure I'm saying correctly. To make the roses, you want to draw a circle with 5 lines that meet at the center. You can make the roses bigger or smaller as long as you always have an uneven number of starting lines. Once you've threaded your needle with your desired color, you want to tie a knot at the end of the thread to keep the thread secure on the fabric. To knot my thread, I hold the end between my thumb and middle finger, wrap the thread around my index finger, then I press the index finger against my thumb over the thread, letting go of the end from my middle finger. Then I roll my index finger down my thumb until the thread is no longer wrapped around it, which creates a little tangle, and then by pulling on that tangle down between my index finger and thumb, it creates a knot. This seems super complicated to explain, but it's actually very quick in real life and becomes intuitive once you figure it out. I try to do it as slowly as possible here, but in real life it takes me like 1 second. Now you can bring the needle up from the back to trace the lines of the roses, starting at the edge of the circle and ending at the center. When you've traced all the lines, bring the needle back to the front, close to the center, and start weaving it through the lines. You want to go over one and under one, alternating around and around. This is why you need an uneven number of lines. Just pass the needle under the stitches you have and over, and in no time, you'll see the rose starting to form. These are called Pinwheel Roses for obvious reasons. There's lots of different ways that you can embroider roses, but this is a very easy one that has a great 3D effect. Once all of the starting lines have been covered in thread and you're happy with your rose, you just bring the needle to the wrong side of the fabric, close to the rose, and tie off your thread. If you want to add stems to your roses, like me, one great stitch is the back stitch. This is a classic stitch that can be used for decoration, and it's a staple in your stitching toolbox. So you bring the needle up at the start of the line after tying a knot at the end and insert the needle back into the fabric a little down the line, depending on what size you want the stitches to be. Next, you bring the needle back out the same distance ahead and pull the thread through. Then you insert the needle back into the closest end of the first stitch. You bring the needle back out one stitch length ahead of where the thread just came out and continue inserting the needle into the end of the previous stitch. Now you just repeat that until you get to the end of the line and tie off the thread. I'll show you how to do the leaves in a second. I'm using the backstitch for the words on this sampler too. Moving on to the lavender, I'm also using the backstitch for the stems. To make the lavender flowers, I'm using this variegated thread. This is a thread that has multiple colors in it, and in this purple, it creates shading and dimension with color without having to switch thread. Perfect for lavender. So for this flower, we're going to use a cute little stitch called a French knot. This creates a raised dot and is great for details or filling in areas. After you thread the needle and tie a knot at the end, you move the thread to the top of your work and wrap the thread around the needle close to the fabric while pulling the end of the thread securely. Insert the needle right next to where it came out from and pull towards the back gently while keeping hold of the extra thread to avoid tangles. Wrapping your thread around the needle more times creates bigger knots and vice versa. I'm doing 3 wraps here. Then you repeat that around the stem to form the shape and size of flower you want. Moving on to the daisies, start by bringing the needle up at the center of the flower and back down again at the same spot, but keep hold of that extra thread. Bring the needle back up at the tip of your petal and loop the extra thread around it, so when you pull through all the way gently, it will form a petal. Then tack the petal in place by inserting the needle into the outside of the loop. This is commonly called a lazy daisy stitch, but its formal name is a detached chain stitch. When you repeat this stitch around one spot, you form a daisy, but you can use this stitch to make leaves, water drops, and lots of other things. To complete the daisy, I like to add a yellow French knot at the center. Moving on to the chamomile, I'm going to show you a couple of new stitches. I showed you how to use the backstitch for the stems, but there's other straight stitches with different looks and textures like the split stitch. This is extremely similar to a backstitch, but when you bring the needle back up to the right side, you're going to do so through the middle of the previous stitch, splitting the thread, which is why it's called a split stitch. You insert the needle back down one stitch size ahead and repeat, always splitting up through the previous stitch. For the petals and the center, I'm going to show you a satin stitch. This is a great way to cover areas with smooth and uniform stitches, but make sure you keep them small for wearable items so they don't snag while wearing. Okay, you bring the needle out at one edge of the petal and insert it back at the other, pulling through. Be careful not to pull too tight, but also not to leave them loose. Next, you insert the needle as close as possible to the top of the previous stitch and back down at the edge of the petal. You want the stitches to be as close as possible without actually overlapping. The direction of the stitches is important here because it can help to create the visual effect of the design you want. For the petals, I'm going top to bottom, but for the center, I'm actually going to do the stitches left to right, so there's a difference in texture. For the sunflower, I'm going to show you yet another way to do a stem. Similar to the lazy daisy stitch, you start with bringing the needle to the top and bringing it down at the same point where you started. Keeping hold of the thread, you bring the needle back up a stitch's length down the line and loop the thread through it. Then you bring the needle back down at that same point and back up another stitch's length down. Repeat this to create a chain. This is called a chain stitch, and it's another great way to create lines or fill in areas. You could keep it just like that, but I'm actually going to show you how you can add to it. When you get to the end of the line, you bring the needle back up to the right side of the fabric and pass the needle under each chain, always on the right side of the fabric. This is called a wrapped chain stitch. When you get to the end of the chain, move the needle back down to the wrong side and tie it off. For this leaf, I'm going to use the satin stitch again. For the petals, I'm doing the satin stitch too. To create the texture of the center, I'm going to use French knot. Finally, to make the hyacinths, I'm using a backstitch for the stems and French knots for the flower. Although this is the same exact stitches I used for the lavender, the shape that I'm creating makes for a totally different look. There's tons of different embroidery stitches, but these ones are probably the ones I use the most because they're super versatile. By playing around with color, thread thickness, direction, and design, you can actually create a ton of different flowers and honestly anything else you want. Once I finished my sampler, I pressed it to make sure that any markings I didn't cover with thread disappear and to help the stitches settle, plus to make the fabric look nice and smooth again. Be careful not to press too hard though, so you don't crush all of your pretty stitches. Okay, we're back. I hope you enjoyed that. Here's my finished sampler. I still don't know what I'm gonna do with it. So in this outro, I am gonna be sharing with you some embroidering inspiration and resources. This is my favorite embroidery book. It's called Jane Austen Embroidery, and it's about what people would have used it for and how people would have used it in the times where Jane Austen was alive, and how she was actually a really adamant embroiderer, I'm not sure. And then you have a bunch of projects that you can do that are like modern projects but have like a very cool antique feel. I've used a lot of the designs on other things, like other projects that I've wanted to do. Next, I have Mystical Stitches by Christy Johnson. This actually is more about how you can use embroidery for personal empowerment and magical embellishment, and it's all about like manifesting. It kind of talks about how you can use embroidery as like a ritualistic and self-care activity. I really like the designs. The book itself is absolutely beautiful. Like the back of the cover is the back of this embroidery, which I think is absolutely genius. There's lots of different things you can embroider, and she talks about like the meaning behind each symbol and how you can use those designs to like manifest whatever you want to manifest. That part of the book I don't like as much because it's just, it doesn't mean anything to me, but the designs are really beautiful. Other resources for like exclusively embroidery designs, you can obviously use Pinterest. Always has lots of inspiration and lots of ideas, so you can use that. A lot of times you'll also see tutorials on there, so that's also a really good resource. And the other one that I really like is DMC.com. Every Sunday they release new designs that are free. They're not always embroidery. Sometimes it's cross stitch, sometimes it's crochet, sometimes it's knitting, sometimes it's macrame, felt crafts. So all of these, they have a bunch of free patterns that you can use, and they're all free. You do have to like sign up to the newsletter, but they don't have a very annoying newsletter because I've been signed up for a few years. These ones I'm going to show you now are not so much of just embroidery, but they're like a bit more ample in what they cover, and I think these are really good if you're interested in learning how to do embroidery for mending specifically. Then I think these are going to give you a lot of good ideas. This one's called Make Do and Mending, and this is from 1943. This is like a reprint obviously of a booklet that was handed out by the government in the UK at the time of the war. The premise of this book was to teach women not only how to better care for their clothes, but also how to mend them, how to transform them, how to refashion things so that they could make the most out of their clothing because of ration. It has a lot of really good ideas of how to care for your clothes, how to make them last longer, how to, properly wash them, how to, transform them. If you're into learning how to mend and better care for your clothes to, better care for your planet, this is a really good way to do it. And on that same note, I have two more books that are covered in thread for some reason. They're very old. One of them is Complete Needlecraft by Agnes M. Miall. And this covers embroidery, knitting and crochet, home dressmaking, home upholstery, etc., etc. So this book is from, I believe, 1935 or 1934, one of the two. It teaches you how to do embroidery. It has little photographs, which is great. It's so much fun. It also covers mending. These are actually really easy to find. I had to look online, and you can find these on eBay for like £5 or $5 or whatever. And on that same note, I have the Art of Needlecraft. This one is in as good shape, but this one actually covers a lot more stuff. So this one has dressmaking, embroidery, curtains, tapestry, knitting, crochet, rug making, weaving, basketry, raffia work, leather work, stencils, batiks, and new ideas. And this one is also from the 30s, and again, it has much of the same idea of like, it has little photographs of ideas. This one might not be as relatable to a lot of you, but it's embroidery and like lace work from Portugal. And this was a school book issued by the Ministry of Education for primary school. And this is from the 70s. And if you don't know any Portuguese history, you probably don't. So in Portugal in the 70s, we were very much under a dictatorship. It has lots of motifs. It has lots of inspiration. It has patterns and stuff. It teaches you like stitches. It teaches you about the history of the stitches, also about the history of lace work, like crochet lace work, you know. It's very interesting and it's very cool in that aspect, but it's also extremely interesting from a historical point of view. People have been using embroidery to decorate and to mend for centuries, and why not continue that? I think it's also the act of embroidery is very meditative. It's very relaxing. God, that was a lot of rambling, am I right? Now that I've shared all of my book nerdery with you, leave me a comment down below if you're gonna give this a try. Do you like embroidery? Have you tried it? Have you not? Is it something you're into? Let me know what your thoughts are all about that. And if you also have a video suggestion, let me know in the comments because I would really appreciate that. If you want more of my nerdery, you can go ahead and follow me on Instagram. I post every single day on there and I am pretty active. So it's a great way to keep up with me if you're interested in that. And you can also follow me on TikTok if that is the app that you prefer using. I have them both linked below in case you want to go and check that out. If you learned something new or just enjoyed hanging out with me, then consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't done that already. It would also mean a lot to me. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and I will see you in the next one.